On the Ides of March, 44 BC, the most powerful man in the world was stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate. The killers expected applause. They walked out into the Roman Forum, blades still wet, expecting the crowd to cheer, to understand, to thank them for what they had done. Instead, the city went silent. Then, it went cold. Then slowly, inexorably, it went dangerous. And somewhere across the Adriatic Sea, in a quiet Greek coastal town called Apollonia, an 18-year-old boy was studying military theory when the messenger arrived. His name was Gaius Octavius. You have never heard that name. History does not remember him by it, because within a year of that message arriving, he would become something else entirely, something Rome had never seen and would never survive. He would become Caesar. But not yet, not here, not now. Right now, he is just a teenager, reading about wars he has never fought, holding a letter that tells him his great-uncle is dead, and that he has been named the primary heir to the most dangerous name in the world. The men who murdered Julius Caesar thought they were saving the Republic. They were not. They were lighting a fuse. And the boy in Apollonia was going to be the one holding it when it finally exploded. This is the story of how an 18-year-old nobody, sickly, untested, and politically invisible, walked into the ruins of a collapsing republic, outmaneuvered every general, every senator, and every killer who stood in his way, and became the first emperor of Rome, not through strength, not through luck, through something far more dangerous, through patience. To understand what Octavian inherited, you have to understand what Rome actually was in 44 BC, because it was not what most people picture. It was not a tidy empire run by an orderly government. It was a city of 1 million people, master of the entire Mediterranean, sustained by a political system designed for a city, state, and bent almost to breaking point, trying to govern a continent. The Roman Republic had worked brilliantly for a time because it distributed power among many competing hands: consuls, senators, tribunes, generals. No single man was supposed to hold it all. That was the whole architecture of the thing. Then Julius Caesar came along. He had not set out to destroy the Republic, or perhaps he had. Historians have argued about this for 2,000 years. What is beyond argument is what he did. He crossed the Rubicon with his army in 49 BC, triggering a civil war. He defeated his enemies. He pardoned them with conspicuous generosity. He became dictator, perpetuo dictator, in perpetuity, which was not quite a king, but close enough that the distinction stopped mattering. He wore a laurel wreath to cover his baldness, and it started to look uncomfortably like a crown. For a faction of senators, men of genuine Republican conviction, or so they believed, this was intolerable. If one man could become permanent dictator, the Republic was already dead. So they decided to kill the man instead of confronting the system that had produced him. 23 senators, daggers hidden under their togas, the Ides of March. They called themselves the Liberators. They were not liberators. They were men who had solved the symptom and ignored the disease. Rome had produced Caesar because Rome needed Caesar or something like him. 100 years of political violence, civil wars, and failed reforms had hollowed out the Republic's institutions until they were shells, performing rituals they no longer had the power to enforce. Killing Caesar did not fix any of that. It simply removed the man who had been holding the wreckage together by force of personality. What filled the vacuum was worse. When Caesar fell, 5 men stepped forward to claim his legacy. 5 different visions of what Rome should become. 5 different sets of armies, loyalties, and ambitions. And somewhere in the middle of all of them, arriving by ship from Greece, carrying nothing but a name he had just legally inherited, was the teenager who would outlast them all. Every advisor Octavian had told him not to come. His mother Atia begged him to wait. His stepfather Philippus counseled patience, caution, discretion. His friends pointed out the obvious. Rome was controlled by Mark Antony Caesar's most experienced lieutenant, a soldier's soldier, physically imposing, charismatic in the way that men who have survived many battles tend to be. Antony had moved fast in the hours after the assassination, while the conspirators stood paralyzed at the Capitol waiting for public approval that never came. He had secured Caesar's body, Caesar's treasury, and Caesar's personal papers. By nightfall on the Ides of March, Antony was effectively in control of Rome, and he had not yet said a word in public. Then he spoke. Caesar's funeral was the moment when the conspiracy died. Antony delivered the oration, and when he revealed that Caesar's will had left 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen, money from a dead man promised to the people, the mood in the forum shifted from confusion to grief to fury in the space of minutes. The conspirators, who had expected to be celebrated, fled Rome within days. They had been right about one thing. Caesar was a danger to the Republic. They had been catastrophically wrong about everything else. So Octavian's advisors were not being cowardly when they told him to stay away. They were being rational. An 18-year-old with no military record and a frail constitution had no business walking into a city controlled by Antony's legions, still tense with the energy of a murder that had not yet resolved itself into order or chaos. Octavian came anyway. This was not recklessness. This was the first demonstration of the quality that would define everything he did for the next 13 years. The ability to calculate risk with cold precision, and then act on that calculation, without hesitation. He understood something his advisors did not. A delayed claim is a lost claim. In Roman political culture, hesitation read as weakness. Caesar's veterans, 40-plus legions scattered across the Mediterranean, waiting to learn what would happen to the land and bonuses Caesar had promised them, were a powder keg looking for a spark. Whoever reached them first, with the most credible claim to Caesar's legacy, could ignite them. Wait too long, and Antony would claim them all. Wait too long, and the conspirators would build their eastern armies into something unstoppable. Wait too long, and Octavian would become a footnote, the heir who never arrived. So he arrived. He stepped onto Italian soil at Brundisium, publicly accepted the adoption, claimed the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and immediately began doing what Antony had refused to do, paying Caesar's personal bequests to Roman citizens out of his own family wealth. Antony controlled Caesar's treasury and had been blocking Octavian's access to it for weeks, partly to humiliate him, partly to strangle his ambitions before they could develop. He expected the boy to fold. Instead, Octavian started selling his own inheritance, mortgaging his family's property, emptying personal reserves. Every denarius he spent on those bequests was a message to the Roman street. This is the true Caesar. This is the one who keeps the promises. And every denarius spent built loyalty that Antony could not easily buy back, because it came not from power but from sacrifice, and Romans noticed the difference. Antony was furious. He publicly dismissed Octavian as a boy playing at politics, refused the meetings, blocked the funds, and made clear through intermediaries that the teenager should go back to studying Greek philosophy and leave Roman power to men who had earned it. He would spend years regretting that dismissal, because while Antony was laughing, something quiet and irreversible was already happening. Caesar's veterans were starting to listen. And here is where the story takes its first dark turn, because the next man to underestimate Octavian was the smartest man in Rome. Cicero was 62 years old, the greatest orator the Republic had ever produced, and a man whose political instincts were brilliant in everything except the one situation that mattered most. He hated Antony with the specific, consuming hatred of someone who recognizes a genuine danger and cannot stop talking about it. He delivered a series of speeches in the Senate, the Philippics. He called them attacking Antony with surgical precision. Antony was a drunk, a thug, a tyrant in waiting, a man who had taken Caesar's dictatorship and was planning to make it permanent under a different name. Much of this was true. The problem was that Cicero had no army. Octavian did, or was building one. Caesar's veterans, responding to the name and the money, were flocking to him. Two of Antony's own legions, the Martian and the Fourth, switched sides. These were experienced men who had fought under Caesar, who resented Antony's arrogance, and who saw in Octavian's combination of the Caesar name and genuine personal generosity something they could follow. Cicero saw this and made his historic miscalculation. He went to the Senate and proposed giving Octavian Propraetorian Command military authority that had no legal precedent for someone of his age, so he could fight Antony. The Senate, desperate and frightened, agreed. Cicero was proud of his maneuver. He had pointed a loaded weapon at his enemy. He had also handed that weapon legs and 4 legions. What Cicero wrote privately to his friends at this moment is one of history's most chilling sentences. The young man should be praised, honored, and removed. He believed he was using Octavian. He had never met anyone like Octavian. That was the problem. The campaign at Mutina in early 43 BC succeeded. Antony was forced to retreat, but then something strange happened. Both consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, died. Hirtius in battle, Pansa of wounds shortly after. Their deaths were convenient enough that rumors circulated for centuries afterward. Was it coincidence, misfortune, or something colder? We cannot know with certainty. What we know is the result. Octavian, now 20 years old, was suddenly the sole surviving commander of 4 veteran legions. The Senate, relieved that Antony had been driven off, decided the crisis was over and began maneuvering to sideline the young general who had helped them, transferring his troops, reducing his authority, making clear that his usefulness had expired. They were not ready for what came next. Octavian made a demand. He wanted the consulship, the highest elected office in the Republic, normally reserved for men in their 40s who had spent decades climbing the political ladder. He was 20 years old. The Senate said no. He marched 8 legions on Rome. The city had no defense. The senators who had been congratulating themselves on their clever management of the young Caesar found themselves staring at the reality of what they had created. They had given him legal authority, veterans, and political legitimacy. They had assumed those things could be taken back. They could not. The Senate capitulated. Octavian was elected consul at 19D, the youngest in the history of the Republic. The election was a formality. The legions outside the city walls were the actual voting mechanism. This was the first great reveal of who Octavian actually was. Not a grateful instrument of Senate policy, not a Republican loyalist who could be directed and then dismissed, but a player operating by an entirely different set of rules than the ones the senators thought they were playing by. Cicero had wanted to use him. Octavian had been using Cicero. And now he was done with him. Because the next move, the move that would shock even hardened Roman political veterans, was not a consolidation of power against Antony. It was a handshake with him. Somewhere near Bononia, on a small island in a river, 3 men met in October of 43 BC. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, the master of horse, the third piece of the puzzle, who controlled legions of his own and had been playing both sides with careful neutrality until now. What they negotiated over 3 days would be called the Second Triumvirate, the legal partition of the known world between 3 men who had just finished trying to destroy each other. They divided it like a map cut with a blade. Antony would take the east, Lepidus the south, Octavian the west, including Italy itself. And then they agreed to something else. Something that would replace the question mark hanging over their alliance with something far darker. The proscriptions, lists of enemies, thousands of names, over 2,000 equestrians, over 300 senators condemned to death, their property confiscated, their heads posted in the forum as proof of execution. It was the purge that made the triumvirate possible, the blood price of the alliance. Antony had names he wanted. Octavian had names he wanted. Among Antony's names was one that mattered enormously: Marcus, Tullius, Cicero. The man who had called Octavian a useful tool. The man who had planned to point him at Antony and then put him down. The man who, even now, was writing letters to the East suggesting that the young Caesar might still be managed if the right pressure were applied. Octavian agreed to Cicero's death without, as far as we can tell, visible hesitation. Cicero was caught on the road trying to flee. He put his head out of his litter and told the soldiers to make it clean. They cut his head and his hands, the hands that had written the Philippics, the hands that had guided Octavian's early career, and brought them to Antony. Antony had them displayed on the rostra in the Forum, the very platform from which Cicero had delivered his greatest speeches. Now those hands were nailed to it. Octavian was 20 years old. He had just authorized the murder of the man who had championed his cause, supported his career, and genuinely believed he was protecting the Republic by doing so. He had done it without sentiment, without ceremony, and without, as far as the historical record shows, any sign that it troubled him. This is the moment that separates Octavian from every other young man who has ever stumbled into great power and been destroyed by it. Most people in that position would have hesitated, would have found some alternative, would have told themselves a story in which they did not have to do the worst thing. Octavian did not tell himself stories. He did what the situation required. In the East, Brutus and Cassius had not been idle. They were the philosophical heart of the conspiracy. Brutus, the idealized face of it; Cassius, the practical engine behind it. Together they had the idea, the ideology, and the act. What they did not have, on the morning after the assassination, was an army, a treasury, a popular mandate, or a plan. So for 2 years they had been building, raising legions from the eastern provinces, taxing cities sometimes brutally, extracting money from local rulers. By late 42 BC, they had assembled 19 legions in Macedonia and Thrace, strong positions, interior supply lines, and the moral authority of men fighting for the Republic against triumviral tyranny. In the autumn of 42 BC, the triumviral armies crossed to Greece to meet them. Antony commanded the main force with his customary aggressive energy. Octavian was present. He was always careful to be present, but he was ill again. His constitution was genuinely fragile, a fact that never stopped being remarkable given what he survived. At the plains near Philippi in Macedonia, the two sides met. The first battle of Philippi was, in military terms, a draw, but a draw with asymmetric consequences. Antony attacked Cassius's camp and broke it. On the other side of the field, Brutus attacked Octavian's camp and overran it. Octavian himself barely escaped, hiding in a marsh, according to some accounts, the kind of unglamorous detail his enemies remembered and he preferred to forget. Cassius, unable to see through the dust cloud obscuring Brutus's sector, believed his entire force had been defeated. He took his own life. He died believing he had lost a battle that, in his own sector, he had won. 3 weeks later, the second battle of Philippi was less ambiguous. Brutus, isolated now and strategically exposed, was forced into an engagement he did not want and was not prepared for. His army collapsed. He died by his own hand in the hills above the battlefield, asking a friend to hold the sword. The Republic died with him. Not because Brutus was the Republic, he was not, but because Brutus was the last man willing to take up arms for the specific idea that Rome could be governed without a monarch. With his death, that argument lost its military expression. It would continue as philosophy, as rhetoric, as nostalgia, but it would never again have legions. Octavian and Antony divided the victory. Antony had done the heavier fighting and was careful to make sure everyone knew it. Octavian's illness, his evacuation from his own camp, the less than heroic details of his conduct at Philippi, these were not secrets. His enemies mocked him for them. He did not argue. He did not explain. He filed the information away and moved on. He understood something his enemies never did. It does not matter how a war is fought. It only matters who is left at the end. After Philippi, the triumvirate's fault lines became impossible to ignore. Antony took the East, the wealthy, sophisticated, culturally dominant half of the Roman world, and went to Egypt, where Cleopatra received him with the full arsenal of her intelligence and political skill. Whatever else they were to each other, they were a genuine political partnership. Antony was brilliant in his own right. In the East, commanding resources that would have made any Roman general drunk with possibility, he managed for a time to hold things together. Octavian got the West, Italy, Rome, the veterans. This sounds like a lesser prize. It was not. It was the prize. Italy was the symbolic heart of the Roman world. The senators, the traditions, the founding myths, the idea of what Rome meant, all of it lived there. And Octavian understood something about power that Antony kept underestimating. Gratitude is transient, but debt is permanent. Men fight for what they own. So he gave 50,000 veterans their farms' ugly, chaotic land redistribution that evicted existing landowners across central Italy, that generated enormous resentment, that poets remembered for decades. But those veterans now owed their farms, their futures, and their children's futures to one man. When Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius raised 8 legions against Octavian in the Perusine War of 41 BC, arguing that his land program was tyrannical, Octavian besieged the city of Perugia through a brutal winter and let it starve. When it fell, he made an unmistakable example. The lesson was simple, and he never needed to repeat it. There is no neutral ground in Italy. Choose or be chosen for. Antony, fighting the Parthians in the east, entangled in Cleopatra's orbit, negotiated rather than fought. The Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC confirmed the division. Antony the east, Octavian the west. To seal it, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, a dignified and intelligent woman whom Antony genuinely seems to have respected, and whom he would eventually abandon in a way that Octavian would weaponize with devastating effect. But the treaty confirmed something more important than any marriage. Octavian controlled Italy. Whoever controls Italy controls the story. And Octavian was, above all else, a master of the story. Pay attention to what he does next, because this is where most people miss how the war was actually won. And it had nothing to do with armies. Between the Treaty of Brundisium and the final reckoning at Actium, a decade passed. This is the period history tends to compress the triumvirate's slow unraveling. Octavian's consolidation of the West, Antony's deepening entanglement in the East as if it were merely prologue to the exciting finale. That is a mistake. Those years were where Octavian actually won. The battle was just the announcement. Consider what he accomplished while Antony was distracted. Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, admiral without equal, the man who had been strangling Rome's grain supply for years, was destroyed in 36 BC by Octavian's general Marcus Agrippa at the Battle of Naulochus. Agrippa was perhaps the greatest military mind in Octavian's circle, a man of obscure origins and extraordinary competence, whom Octavian had the intelligence to trust completely and promote without jealousy. The victory cleared the sea lanes, fed the city, and crucially, gave Octavian a battle-hardened navy. The same year, Lepidus attempted a power play in Sicily, claiming the island for himself. Octavian walked into his camp alone, or so the story goes, and simply told his soldiers that they were Caesar's veterans, and this was not what Caesar's veterans did. The soldiers agreed. Lepidus was stripped of his triumviral powers, allowed to keep his life and dignity, and spent the rest of his long years as chief priest of Rome an honorable cage. He would outlive everyone. He died in 13 BC, a very old man who had missed everything that mattered. Now it was just 2. And here is what Antony did not understand. The real battle was not being fought on any map he was looking at. In Rome, Octavian's political machine, operating through literature, rumor, and carefully managed public image rather than anything as crude as press releases, was working the story of Antony and Cleopatra with relentless precision. Romans were not inherently scandalized by a powerful man having powerful relationships. They were scandalized by the suggestion that Rome's dignity was being subordinated to a foreign queen's ambition, and so the stories accumulated. Antony prostrating himself before Cleopatra, Antony distributing Roman territories, provinces, client kingdoms, futures to Cleopatra's children, as if they were his to give. And then the story that cut deepest of all, Antony declaring Caesarion Cleopatra's son, whom she claimed was Julius Caesar's biological heir, to be the true Caesar, the real one, the blood one. Remember that boy 17 years old now, growing up in Alexandria under his mother's protection, because this declaration was not just an insult to Octavian, it was an existential threat. If Caesarion's claim were recognized, Octavian's entire position, his adoption, his name, his 13 years of ruthless work collapsed overnight. A blood heir trumps an adopted one. Octavian had known this since 44 BC. He had known it the day he first read the will, and now Antony was pointing at that sword and pressing it toward his throat. Octavian's response was to read Antony's will in the Senate. Whether it was genuine, whether it had been altered, whether he obtained it through subterfuge, these questions remain unanswered. What matters is the effect. The senators heard that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, that he had bequeathed Roman territories to foreign children, that Rome's interest was secondary to an Egyptian queen's. The Senate erupted. But here is the stroke of political genius that most people miss. War was not declared on Mark Antony. It was declared on Cleopatra. Romans. Fighting Romans is civil war, shameful, illegal in tradition, destructive of the image of Roman unity. But Romans defending Rome against a foreign enemy queen who had seduced their general and turned him against his homeland, that was righteous. That was duty. That was exactly the kind of war Roman virtue was built to fight. Octavian had transformed a civil war into a foreign war without changing a single fact on the ground. He had changed the story, and in Rome, the story was everything. September 2nd, 31 BC. The waters off the promontory of Actium, on the northwestern coast of Greece. 2 fleets facing each other across a stretch of water that would determine whether Rome was governed from the Tiber or the Nile. On paper, the numbers favored Antony and Cleopatra. Approximately 500 ships, 19 veteran legions on shore, the wealth of Egypt behind them, the resources of the entire eastern Mediterranean. But paper is not the battlefield. And by September of 31 BC, Antony's force was not the army it appeared to be on any map. His legions had been camped on that malarial coast since spring. Disease had been working through them for months, killing soldiers that no enemy sword had reached. His naval crews were undermanned. He had been forced to burn some of his own ships rather than leave them sailing with skeleton crews. The camp was rotting. Morale was fracturing. And then the defections began. Roman officers who had followed Antony for years started crossing to Octavian's lines. They carried intelligence, the disposition of the fleet, the weaknesses in his planning, the internal divisions corroding his command structure. An army whose officers are leaving is an army whose spirit is already broken. Agrippa, meanwhile, had spent months working the blockade, cutting off Antony's supply lines, seizing his forward positions, denying him the ability to reinforce or resupply. By the time battle came, Antony was not choosing between fight and retreat. He was choosing between a controlled breakout and slow disintegration. The battle began in the late morning. What happened next is still debated. What is clear is this. At some point during the engagement, Cleopatra's squadron 60 ships carrying the royal treasury broke through the line and set course south toward Egypt. Antony followed. He transferred from his flagship to a smaller vessel and pursued Cleopatra's fleet into the open sea. He left his fleet. He left his legions. He left 40,000 soldiers on the shore at Actium who had fought for him, bled for him, and who now stood on those cliffs and watched their commanders' sail disappear over the horizon. Think about that moment. 40,000 men watching. The fleet, deprived of its commander, fought on for a time, then surrendered. The legions, watching from the cliffs, waited. Within days, most had capitulated. They were Caesar's veterans. Octavian was Caesar's heir. In the end, they did what soldiers do when the situation is decided. They went home. We do not know whether Antony's departure was a planned breakout. Preserve the treasury, preserve the queen, fight again from Egypt, or something that happened faster and more instinctively than any plan. What we know is this. Antony himself seems to have understood exactly what it meant. The accounts describe him sitting in the prow of his ship for days afterward, alone, staring at nothing, speaking to no one. He had left his men on a shore. He knew what that was. Whatever the plan had been, it was over. Octavian moved east at his leisure. There was no hurry now. In Alexandria, in the late summer of 30 BC, the last acts of the old world played out with the compressed, brutal efficiency that power uses when it has nothing left to prove. Antony's remaining forces dissolved on contact with Octavian's advancing army. There was no second Philippi, no last stand. Each legion, each ally, each city calculated its odds and chose surrender over annihilation. By the time Octavian reached the gates, Antony commanded nothing. He fell on his own sword. Roman generals who had lost everything had a tradition to maintain, and Antony at least attempted it, though he managed to do even this imperfectly, wounding himself mortally, but not immediately. He died slowly, in Cleopatra's arms, it was said. Whether the scene was as dramatic as the sources describe or shaped by the victor's propaganda, we cannot be certain. What is certain is that he died in a city that was no longer his, having lost everything to a man he had never taken seriously. Cleopatra survived him by days. She met with Octavian. She had spent her life reading powerful men, and she read him now with the same cold intelligence she had applied to Caesar, to Antony, to every king and general who had passed through her orbit. She understood that he intended to take her to Rome, to parade her in chains through the city as proof of his triumph, to display her as the foreign temptress who had corrupted Rome's greatest general, now defeated and humiliated before the Roman crowd. She had walked through Rome before at Caesar's triumph. She had survived that. She chose not to survive this one. The manner of her death is one of history's most romanticized mysteries. The asp in the basket of figs, the snake against the bare arm, the theatrical last gesture of a woman who had always understood theater. Modern scholars debate whether the story is accurate or invented. What is beyond debate is that she died on her own terms, which was the only way Cleopatra had ever done anything. And then Octavian did the thing that made everything else comprehensible. He ordered the execution of Caesarion, Julius Caesar's blood son, 17 years old. The boy who had grown up in Alexandria carrying the most dangerous name in the world, not as a legal title, but as biology, as fact, as the kind of claim that no amount of politics or propaganda could erase as long as he was breathing. His existence was the one argument Octavian could never win in a court of law. A blood heir trumps an adopted one, always. So the adopted one made sure there was no blood heir. 2 Caesars is too many, Octavian reportedly said. The sentiment, Whether the exact words are his is authentic. The boy was killed, and Octavian, age 32, stood alone. No rivals, no co-rulers, no one left who remembered a Rome before him clearly enough to imagine one after him. He looked out over a world that was, at last, entirely his. What happened next was the most sophisticated performance in Roman political history. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 BC and celebrated 3 triumphs, the legal ceremonies of military victory that Romans understood as the highest honor the state could grant. And then, in January of 27 BC, he stood before the Senate and did something no one expected. He offered to resign. The emergency was over, he said. The civil wars were finished. The Republic could be restored. He was returning authority to the Senate and the Roman people. He was stepping down. The senators, most of whom had been carefully selected, and all of whom were deeply aware of what refusing would mean, responded exactly as he had intended. They begged him to stay. They poured honors upon him with the urgent generosity of men who understand they are not actually making a choice. They gave him command of the crucial frontier provinces, the ones with the legions. They gave him tribunician power for life. They gave him proconsular authority that extended across the empire. And they gave him a new title, Augustus, the revered one, a word with religious weight that no Roman had ever held as a permanent designation. He accepted all of it with becoming modesty. He did not call himself king. He called himself princeps, first citizen. He did not abolish the Senate. He let it meet, vote, debate, and administer the parts of the empire he found convenient to administer through it. He did not cancel elections. They continued, with outcomes rarely in doubt. Julius Caesar had made the same moves, the power, the authority, the domination, and had made one catastrophic mistake. He was honest about it. He wore the laurel wreath in public and sat while senators stood. He let the reality of what he was become visible, and the senators who valued the illusion of republican dignity sent men with daggers to restore it. Augustus understood the lesson completely. The reality of power was identical. The performance of power was everything. As long as the forms were respected, the substance could go unmentioned. As long as the Senate was allowed to feel that it governed, it would consent to being governed. As long as the elections happened, no one needed to examine too closely who was winning them. He had watched a city tear itself apart for a generation because one man refused to maintain the necessary fiction. He would maintain it for the rest of his long, remarkable life. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is not a myth. It was real, and it was earned after a century of civil war that had begun with the Gracchi brothers in 133 BC and had not stopped since Marius, Sulla, Caesar, Pompey, the triumvirates, the proscriptions. The endless burning of the Italian countryside Rome was exhausted in the way that only civilizations that have been consuming themselves for 100 years can be exhausted. The people had lived through enough upheaval that peace was not a political abstraction. It was something they wanted the way a drowning man wants air, with their whole bodies, without qualification. Augustus delivered it. He settled veterans on their farms, and the farms stayed theirs. He secured the grain supply from Egypt, and the city ate. He rebuilt Rome in marble. He would claim on his deathbed that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, which was an exaggeration, but not entirely false. He reformed the army, the courts, the tax system, the administration. He created a professional civil service that could actually govern vast territories rather than improvising year to year as the Republic always had. Trade routes stayed open. Merchants could plan. Poets Virgil, Horace, Ovid produced work of such extraordinary quality that the entire era carries his name, the Augustan Age. History does not give ages to chaotic or brutal rulers. It gives them to men who create the conditions for civilization to flower. But underneath all of it, buried in the foundations of the system he had built with such painstaking care, was a structural flaw that Augustus himself recognized and never solved. The Principate, the whole magnificent architecture of the thing, depended entirely on the character of whoever held the top position. There was no constitutional mechanism to ensure that the next princeps would be Augustus. No reliable check that could stop a bad emperor once he decided to be bad. The Senate had the forms, but not the power. The army had the power, but answered to whoever commanded it. And there was always the danger that the army would simply decide for itself who that should be. Augustus spent years trying to solve the succession problem, the same problem the Republic had never needed to solve because it had never had a monarch. He outlived multiple designated heirs. His beloved nephew Marcellus died young. His greatest general Agrippa was positioned and repositioned. He adopted Tiberius competent, cold, unloved, because Tiberius was what was left. When Augustus died in 14 AD, at 75, having ruled Rome for 44 years, he had given the world a gift of extraordinary value, and buried inside it a flaw that would eventually kill everything he had built. Within 50 years, Caligula would reign. Within a century, 4 men would seize the purple in a single year and demonstrate that the army could unmake as easily as it made. The brilliant fiction Augustus had maintained would fray and eventually tear, but not yet, not for a long time. History often tells this story as a story of triumph. The boy who became an emperor, the teenager who inherited a civil war and ended it, and that is true. But the deeper truth is stranger and colder than triumph. Octavian won because he was the only man in Rome who understood what the game actually was. Everyone else, Antony, Cicero, Brutus, Cassius, Lepidus, Sextus, Pompey, played by rules they believed were stable. They treated the Republic as a real institution with real power, or they treated brute military force as the ultimate argument, or they believed that philosophy and ideology and the weight of tradition could hold against legions. Octavian understood that the Republic was already gone. He understood that the question was not whether Rome would have a monarch, but what that monarch would call himself. He understood that the most dangerous weapon in Roman politics was not a sword or a legion, but a name, and he had the best one. He understood that patience, in a world where everyone else was impatient, was a kind of superpower. He was not the strongest man in Rome. He was never the strongest man in the room. He was sick, slight, militarily undistinguished. Philippi made that clear in ways his enemies enjoyed recounting. What he was instead was the most intelligent person in any room he entered, not brilliant in the way that generates great speeches or daring battlefield maneuvers. Intelligent in the way that reads a situation correctly, identifies what must be done, waits for the precise moment, and acts without hesitation when that moment arrives. He let stronger men destroy each other. He outlasted the impatient and the reckless. He allowed his enemies to underestimate him, and then he demonstrated, one by one, what underestimating him cost. Cicero called him a useful tool and died because of the error. Antony called him a boy and spent 13 years watching that boy dismantle everything he had built. The Senate thought it was using him, right up until the moment it found itself offering him titles and begging him to stay. There is a lesson in this about power, the cold, disquieting kind of lesson that history offers when you look at it directly and refuse to look away. The most dangerous person in any struggle is not the one who seems most powerful. It is the one that no one bothers to fear. That boy who stepped off the ship at Brundisium in 44 BC, carrying nothing but a name and a will, surrounded by people who expected him to fail, or planned to use him, or simply didn't think he mattered. That boy went on to become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the architect of the most successful political system the ancient world ever produced. He was 18 when he arrived. He was 20 when he marched on Rome. He was 32 when he stood alone over the ruins of everything that had tried to stop him. He lived to 75. He died in his bed. He outlived every single person who had ever underestimated him. And of all the remarkable things about that, the decades, the wars, the extraordinary cold intelligence of his survival, perhaps the most remarkable is this. He never stopped pretending to be something other than what he was. He was Rome's last republican and its first emperor, and he knew the difference, and he never once let on.